Countries generally borrow money to cover financial deficits so that they can provide services to their citizens. Drowning under the weight of staggering debt, slow economic growth and disappointing tax collections, South Africa's debt to GDP ratio is now sitting at well over 50%. This effectively means the country is paying for past sins by borrowing from the next generation of South Africans, banking on the hope that these young South Africans will be productive and more and be able to pay back the debt. What will the real cost of this be, and how can we fix it? And to discuss this, I'm joined by political economist Sia Beniza and economist Lumkile Mondi. Gentlemen, good evening and welcome.
Good evening. Good evening.
And a pleasure to have both of you on the program. You know, when we were putting this together and going through research material to prepare for the show, I kept asking myself this question: why are we discussing this? Is it relevant, Lumkile, that we discuss this matter? Because, you know, I read a report that suggests it's touching 3 trillion rands now, 3,000 billion rands. And of course, when I had the Minister of Public Enterprises yesterday saying that Eskom needed an additional 250 billion,
yes,
I said, wow, we are in a situation here.
We're in a very serious situation, and it all talks to economic management. I think what we've seen, particularly in the past 10 years, is really the weakening of capability of the state, particularly the corruption that has been taking place and mismanagement of resources. Tim, I just want to remind us that in 2007, in fact 2008 to be exact, is that South Africa had about debt to GDP just under 30%, around 28%. And to date, we're sitting at about 56%, double that amount. And we've got nothing to show for it. Because if you look into the investment that we've done, whether it's on the energy side, we're far below, the demand is low, but even the capacity is far low than what we had in 2007. And then if you go to road infrastructure, our construction companies have collapsed because there's been no investment on infrastructure. So these issues indicate to us there's been a lot of leakage taking place. Therefore, a lot of the money that was wasted has gone into consumption rather than fixed investment, where you can see that the cost of doing business are low. Therefore, going forward, we can create opportunities because businesses can invest at a far cheaper cost.
Well, you know, in the past, the talk would be that we're talking the country down when you raise these things. But, you know, it looks like we are in a fix now, in a situation. Or is it the kind of situations here that South Africa can manage itself out of, you know, given the growth rate of 1% on one hand, and the payment on interest is what, 4-point-something% of the GDP? Yeah. So how do you balance that?
Yeah, look, I think it's a serious challenge that we're faced, but I must warn people that, you know, governments never necessarily pay off their debts. What governments seek to do is to generate enough economic growth so that the size of the debt relative to the economy keeps shrinking. And the problem in South Africa, and I'm glad you mentioned the issue of slow growth, is that we haven't been growing enough, and that's mainly because most of our financial or public financial investments that are supposed to go to infrastructure, etc., are somehow diverted to a large extent, and we are not getting the amount of returns we should be getting from the public investments that we're getting. But I think at the same time, the government has its back against the ropes, given the poor and low levels of private investment and the high levels in terms of financial investment. So what we have in South Africa is that there are some financial returns taking place, but those aren't necessarily reinvested to create jobs. They are reinvested in the stock exchange, they are reinvested in the rest of the continent. And so government is left on its own in terms of investing to create the economic returns that are needed to pay back the debt.
But where is government investing? You say government is left on its own to invest. Where is that investment taking place?
Well, it's largely been in infrastructure, but again, the problem that Mondi is bringing up on the issue of economic management is what's bringing us back. The fact that our SOEs, such as South African Airways, go and get commercial debts that they default on, putting government at jeopardy to the extent that we need to bail them out on 2 billion rand or 8 billion rand on a multiple year basis is what's bringing us back. The fact that we lose over 400 billion due to misappropriation at ESCOM on the electricity investment program is why we're coming back. I don't think that our government is necessarily investing in the wrong areas. If we compare ourselves to neighboring countries, think of Zambia, think of Zimbabwe, where the investment in public infrastructure has been in roads and not economic infrastructure.
Is that where South Africa is now, that it should compare itself to Zimbabwe, you believe?
Well, these are our neighboring countries,
yes.
and I mean, they are some sort of benchmark. But definitely, I think the problem of economic management, as you mentioned, is at the core of what's not allowing us to generate the economic returns in order to pay back the debt. But then, high unemployment and inequality also.
The country is highly indebted at this time, right? And I will also talk about the per capita GDP, where it is, because again, it looks like it's gone down.
We're getting poorer.
So it means even getting poorer on a GDP ratio, yeah?
Per capita. So the middle class, which is the biggest component, given the fact that those elite that own the biggest resources in South Africa and the rest of the world are a tiny minority. The rest of the people are in the middle class. That's where the pinch is, where because of high tax levels, both at national level, but also at local level. If you look at the road e-tolls, you look at the tariffs that are going up in the next years, particularly electricity. Water is going to have to go up as well, given that water is a scarce resource, and we've underinvested in that. And also, the inability or the lack of capability of the state, whether it's police, whether it's the school system, where people have gone to fund their own protection through private security or go to private schools. So people are stretched, but also that the income of the country is growing about just under 1%, as we've discussed earlier. So therefore, it's making it very difficult for even households to survive. And and also, given that we've seen the track record of the ANC government in the past 25 years. That's been very dismal, but in the last 10 years. So any reforms, really, whether they're going to happen, given the division in the ANC, remains questionable. So going forward, really, it's going to be very, very, very hard, because I don't see any of these reforms coming through, given the noise that came out, particularly when the president announced the restructuring of ESCOM, where people are very quick to say, we restructure, there's no jobs that's going to be lost, won't bring private sector to generate. So therefore, really, this country is a country slowly going down.
Yeah, well, I think it's Ernest Hemingway who was quoted as saying that, countries collapse slowly, and then pretty quickly. But then, of course, there's something you can do about it, isn't it? I mean, the president, Cyril Ramaphosa, said that he's aiming to raise around $100 billion over a 5-year period. But what base is he working on? What has been foreign direct investments performance like over the past 5 or 10 years?
So in foreign direct investments have been quite volatile, generally around 3 to 6 billion per year. But the challenge with the foreign direct investments is that they've been mainly targeted at mergers and acquisitions. These aren't necessarily bringing new factories to South Africa. These are simply saying South Africa's got a few giants that the foreigners are trying to buy out, and then, as we had with the SAB, as we had with a number of private sector companies. And so from my perspective, I think this is definitely a worrisome area to go into, trying to, borrow from the global markets, because at least despite the challenges we're raising on public debt, South Africa has the reprieve that 90% of its debt is domestic currency denominated, which means that the fluctuations in exchange rate don't affect our ability to repay back.
But so who should be concerned about that?
The savers.
And those would be what? Retirement funds?
You, all of us, the three of us here, saving our retirement annuity, that if a government prescribes our asset, how we should invest, and is unable to pay us back, it means that even your retirement team, you may not get your money that you invested. So really, it's putting a lot of pressure on us as voters around the choices that we're making on the 8th of May. Whether which of the parties does have a program of reinvigorating this economy.
Here's the thing. You're making a point, and I've been asking myself the same question, that we haven't, as citizens, voters, even the media, asked those questions about the economic performance. One would have thought that it would be at the center,
Yes.
as an issue for these elections, but it isn't. It may be. I may not be paying attention. Do you think that?
Look, I definitely think that it's been overshadowed by the talk and the rhetoric on corruption and anti-corruption.
Yeah.
What I would like to see, and it speaks to what we've been discussing, the middle class and everybody else having to pay, because eventually what we're doing is we're giving politicians a reprieve in terms of financial mismanagement. They get away, the money leaves the country, then we raise taxes in order to make up for the deficit. And I think that's definitely the wrong approach. What I would like to see is how government is going to recover some of the monies we've lost through state capture, how government is going to attach people's assets, etc., for those who have been found guilty of financial mismanagement. And I think that is really the way what should be driving the discussion. And yes, the economic discussion is part of that, because we're now resuscitating and repurposing our assets to create that return.
Well, let's talk about hope, because when you are in difficult situations, you've got to have hope.
Yes.
And through hope, build confidence and have faith that you will be able to turn things around, right?
Yes.
Now, people are facing difficulties. We spoke about the middle class, for instance. And what about the multitudes of young people who are unemployed, and some have never been employed for more than 10 years or so? What kind of hope then can they be given? Who should they expect it from? From the business sector, from government, from the unions, from the media, from the churches?
Well, I mean, there's very little opportunities open for the youth. Remember, Tim, we have now a lot of information experiences of post-colonial African countries. They all have gone that route where everything falls apart. And then after that, some new leadership comes in to try and resuscitate. In the South African case, if you look at the list of some of the governing party, it indicates to me at least that there's very little that's going to change from what we've seen in the past 10 years. Therefore, the issue of hope, I think, is still too early to talk about, because hope requires a complete restructuring, a complete focus, bringing in capability and people that have got the know-how. That list is the very same people that were defending President Zuma about 8 times Parliament. They've washed by. If we didn't have a strong media, we didn't have strong civil society, no independent judiciary, we'll probably be far down the line that I described earlier. So I'm a bit very pessimistic.
Yeah.
Not pessimistic because I'm anti the country.
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
pessimistic because of the capability that I see in front of me.
Let's try and fix a problem in 2 minutes if we can. High unemployment rate. High unemployment rate.
Yeah.
And, very few democracies would survive this kind of unemployment rate. Yeah. What is to be done? How can it be done?
It's a difficult question because it depends on which side of the class line you sit on. People with capital don't like to be told what to do with that capital. And that's why, despite some of the economic returns we face, they're reinvesting that in financial markets and in financial instruments and not real economy and creating jobs. But I think the way out of this, and I think it speaks to what we've delayed as a country for a long time in terms of economic redistribution. So yes, we've wiped the slate clean in terms of the political rehabilitation we went through post-apartheid, but we still didn't deal with the problem of economic redistribution. I, for one, would say the government should approach this from an economic point of view and benchmark returns in the economy in terms of the real sector versus what people are getting in the financial sector. And if you're invested in assets that are creating lower returns than what you could get from the real sector, we should be taxing those, but then using that tax money in order to create quite conservative economic investments in the economy.
I know it's a short time, but just bullet points.
Yeah. Firstly, restructure the public service, sell some of the state assets, and call the nation to tighten its belt because the focus is on cutting costs and living within our means, given that we don't have much going around. And then the jobs will follow. After we've restructured the economy, made it smaller, with a view that by doing that, we're creating an opportunity by lowering those costs, create a platform for our domestic investors to work in a low-cost environment to build for the future.
All right, thanks very much to Lumkile and Sia for having been with me this evening. And I hope that somehow the economic challenges become the key focus in the forthcoming elections. Much appreciated, and thanks for your insights.
Thank you so much.
Still ahead, in a country faced with fierce competition for scarce resources such as houses and jobs, do foreign nationals in South Africa compound the levels of poverty and unemployment of local citizens? Then later we'll be paying tribute to Bra Hugh. He was honored on what would have been his 80th birthday by Google yesterday.